Hi guys. This is part two. Had a lot of changes tonight. I had to change a whole bunch of stuff today. Just trying to keep it all running. But I hope you enjoy it. Last session, what did we do? I can't remember what game I played Fallout New Vegas and Overwatch 2 tonight. I lost a session due to my hard drive filled up. So here's the next one, part two. You know what I'm saying? I hope you enjoy some Rust. Gonna play Rust for a couple of hours here, and then I'm gonna go play New World. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the attention. Enjoy.
House searches. Civilians of military age were arrested at random.
The occupying forces took terrible revenge for the attack. The next day, Gottfried Kessel filmed the execution of alleged partisans in Pančevo. In a staged trial, those accused of guerrilla activity had no chance to defend themselves. As a deterrent, 17 men and 1 woman were hanged in public. The gruesome task was performed by an ethnic German executioner. Then 12 former Serbian soldiers were lined up on the cemetery wall in Pančevo and executed by firing squad. Gottfried Kessel also filmed this brutal act for his war diary. This scene, where a German soldier gives the coup de grace to one of the men, became one of the most abhorrent symbols of German crimes committed during the Second World War.
On August the 28th, 1941, Adolf Hitler met with Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The Duce had come especially to witness the successful progress of the campaign against the Soviet Union, one in which Italian troops were also involved. 2 months previously, despite the existence of a non-aggression pact, Nazi Germany had attacked Russia. The Red Army, it seems, was ill-prepared for the invasion, because Joseph Stalin had ignored all warnings right to the very end. In less than a week, German troops had swept through that part of Poland annexed by the Soviet Union and advanced into the Ukraine. Lunchtime for high-ranking officers and their adjutants. This colour footage was taken by Hans Bauer, a keen amateur photographer who had been Hitler's chief pilot ever since 1933. His position enabled him to take pictures even in the immediate vicinity of the dictator without any restrictions. On a flight to the front, Bauer took the opportunity to film Mussolini from close up, because the Duce liked to sit in the cockpit. Later, Bauer remembered,
It took 6 meters of flight, but Mussolini sat there like a stuffed duck, stiff as a board. With his head held high, he didn't move a muscle. All I got were pictures with no life to them. With his chin jutting out, Mussolini had this wild look in his eyes, but he never moved.
Hitler and Mussolini had flown to Uman on a troop visit. The men gave the Führer an overwhelming reception. During their advance, many of them had been involved in crimes against the civilian population. Also present in Uman was Hitler's personal cameraman. Walter Frenz was filming the staged scene officially for the Wochenschau weekly newsreel, but in black and white.
In a battle of encirclement which had lasted from July the 15th to August the 8th, the dictator's troops had defeated 20 divisions of the Red Army and paved the way for an advance into the Donbas region and the hinterland of the Ukraine. 100,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner.
As Hitler and his entourage were returning to their aircraft, the injured troops who had been brought in as a backdrop were driven back to their field hospitals. Some of the men had had terrible experiences. In a state of despair, Corporal Alois Scheuer wrote,
"We now know the full tragedy of war. It's the greatest disaster to befall mankind. It brutalizes people. Only my faith stops me from becoming almost apathetic, mentally and spiritually."
That was of no interest to either the high-ranking officers or the Nazi bigwigs accompanying the two dictators. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann were particularly compliant aides to the Führer, who is said to have told a small circle of associates that
Basically, the war in the East has already been won. Moscow will be razed to the ground.
However, within a few months, the war had become a nightmare for his troops. Yet it wasn't Stalin's armies that had brought the German advance to a halt, but rain and cold.
The Obersalzberg, early June 1942. Hitler was relaxing in the mountains for a few days. The campaign against the Red Army had become bogged down outside Moscow and Leningrad in the mud and snow of winter. Now, a major offensive was to give fresh momentum to the Führer's faltering blitzkrieg. Hitler's guest at the Berghof on this occasion was Sepp Dietrich. The head of the SS-Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was one of the Führer's old comrades from the early days of the Nazi movement. After Hitler seized power, this unquestioningly loyal war horse had had murders carried out time and again on behalf of his master. To mark Dietrich's birthday, the Führer made him a personal gift of 100,000 Reichsmarks and appointed him Colonel General of the Waffen-SS.
This footage stems from Eva Braun's estate. Sepp Dietrich is joking around with Eva's sister Gretel, who was part of Hitler's court. Dietrich with the children of Hitler's favorite architect, Albert Speer. Dietrich was allowed to accompany the Führer on his daily walk up to a peak called the Mooslaner Kopf. Dietrich's troops had already burned villages on the campaigns in Poland and France and committed numerous crimes against the civilian population. On Hitler's orders, they had also been involved in the systematic murder of Polish Jews. The Waffen-SS had carried out further massacres in the Ukraine and in Russia. Before the war against the Soviet Union, the commander-in-chief had told his generals of his true intentions.
It will be a war of annihilation. Our military leaders must make the personal sacrifice of overcoming their misgivings.
Around roughly the same time, a camera of the Army's propaganda unit was filming the Wehrmacht's advance in the Soviet Union. Hans Bastanier and his team had 35mm color film at their disposal. The 31-year-old convinced Nazi had been chosen to produce a spectacular film using the newly developed material. The propaganda ministry wanted to see heroes, and Bastanier provided the requisite pictures. In discussions with the Soviets in 1941, Hitler had already talked through plans for the future face of Eastern Europe. The goal, he said, was to conquer vast areas to ensure the racial survival of the Germans.
The law of natural selection justifies this eternal battle because it makes the survival of the fittest possible. It's absurd that the higher-ranking people should struggle to exist on land that is too restricted, while amorphous masses who contribute nothing to civilization occupy endless areas of terrain which is among the richest in the world. The Crimea and the Ukraine will become a totally German colony, and the previous inhabitants will be displaced. "30 million people in the East were to fall victim to Hitler's monstrous plans. As Nazi ideologists saw it,
Communists, Jews, and members of a wide range of Slavic tribes would have to make way for the master race. Within a few months, SS Special Task Forces operating behind the front had murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews.
Linz in Upper Austria. On April the 20th, 1942, the whole town was dressed up and taking part in processions to celebrate the Führer's birthday. The formations included the Hitler Youth and the Federation of German Girls. Linz proudly carried the title of the Führer's adoptive city because this is where Hitler spent most of his youth. After final victory had been achieved, he planned to spend his twilight years in Linz. Colossal buildings had long since been planned for construction. At this point in time, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, a journalist who was critical of the regime, was hoping that more and more Germans would turn their back on the regime. In summer 1942, she wrote in her diary,
The age of the individual is over. The strong are no longer at their most powerful when they are on their own. We must form a shock troop right across Berlin. Our people must be in position in every district. Sworn Confederates who can be trusted implicitly. Old circles of friends are no longer adequate, and not all of them are suitable. New people need to be found from every camp. Each individual must bring his or her clique into play with all their connections and possibilities. What one person lacks, the other will provide. It's now about distributing roles, yet without getting caught by the Gestapo.
In Linz, party bigwigs paid homage to the dictator. The dignitaries of the Nazi Reich were still fully behind their Führer, and most of them would give him fanatical support right to the end.
On May the 12th, 1942, the Red Army launched a major offensive on a broad front. The aim was to retake Kharkov. Hans Bastanier was sitting with his camera in a German tank, filming the battle. To the northeast of the city, a Wehrmacht tank unit had been given the task of repulsing units of the Soviet 28th Army. The propaganda ministry planned to use the footage in The Front in Color, a monthly newsreel which would only be shown in cinemas in neutral foreign countries. Stalin's forces sustained heavy losses and failed to achieve their goal of breaking through the defensive ring in front of Kharkov.
But the Wehrmacht's counter-offensive was successful. On May the 22nd, 1942, the Soviet armies were encircled and the Germans took around 240,000 prisoners. Pictures from the center of Kharkov.
Hans Bastanier was a specialist in color photography, and he succeeded in attaining the required quality standards. But the planned monthly newsreel never materialized. Only a few scenes on his film were used in German weekly newsreels, in black and white.
The German troops stationed in Kharkov were to lack nothing. Entertainment films were provided to make them forget the horrors of war for a few hours. In the soldiers' hostels, the troops' needs were seen to. It wasn't until August 1943 that the Red Army was finally able to liberate Kharkov. The cameraman also filmed these motorcycle riflemen with the 3rd Armored Reconnaissance Unit. At the time, Ruth Andreas Friedrich noted,
"The Germans are still victorious in Russia. People still talk of Stalin now throwing his final reserves into battle against us. But Moscow today lies many kilometers behind the Russian front. And even though every week sees a few dozen readers' letters arriving at the publishing house, sent by enthusiastic final victory apostles wanting information on settlement opportunities in the Crimea and the Caucasus, the last word still hasn't been spoken about the Caucasus either. The war can still be lost even beyond the Elbrus."
On August the 21st, 1942, mountain troops from Bavaria had indeed scaled the highest peak in the Caucasus and planted the imperial war flag on Mount Elbrus. But the poor weather ruled out any photographs or film footage of the event. So in early September, the Armed Forces High Command sent experienced climber and cameraman Hans Ertl into the mountain range to restage the heroic deed in bright sunshine.
Ertl took the opportunity to film German mountain troops driving out Red Army forces who had occupied an important pass. As a former cameraman with Leni Riefenstahl, he was an adept filmmaker. The film Ertl completed in June 1943 was entitled Alarm on the Pass. For many years it was thought to have been lost. It was only in the late 90s that a copy turned up in Russia.
On March the 18th, 1943, a documentary appeared in cinemas in America which showed the advance of Allied troops in North Africa. The director was none other than Hollywood supremo John Ford. After his award-winning films on the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the battle for Midway Island in the Pacific, the Oscar-winning director also wanted to present the war against the Nazis in color.
On November the 8th, 1942, British and American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. A short time later, 40 camera teams unloaded their equipment. The expedition was headed by Hollywood mogul Darryl F. Zanuck, one of the founders of 20th Century Fox. The film contained expressive footage, but one US critic later complained that
At the front in North Africa clearly bears Zanuck's signature, artistic shots of tank trucks, sunrise and sunsets, and no end of superfluous frills.
behind the front, a camera team witnessed an attack by German aircraft and took dramatic pictures. Director John Ford was in his element. He had already recorded similarly spectacular footage in his film The Battle of Midway. But for his employers at the War Department, this wasn't enough. The problem was that the scenes were totally authentic and thus inadequate for the military authorities. The British enjoyed great success with their Desert Victory production, but many of the dramatic scenes in it had been quickly restaged. When Secretary of War Henry Stimson saw At the Front in North Africa, he found the film feeble and not very inspiring. In his diary he wrote,
We have only just realized the importance of such efforts. Our cameramen obviously have no desire to get killed. The British have lost 4 cameramen and many more have been wounded. We must be willing to take a more energetic approach and thus do a better job.
Scenes which the team filmed in their spare time, far from the front, came in for particular criticism. Here the soldiers have got hold of a turkey, because in America on November the 26th, 1942, people were celebrating Thanksgiving. Then the director himself appears in the picture, John Ford sitting astride a donkey. In early December, when German and Allied armoured units clashed not far from Tunis, Ford's camera teams were present. Hitler had ordered the new Tiger tanks to be sent not to the Eastern Front, but to North Africa, where they inflicted a bitter defeat on the advancing British and Americans. A cameraman had entrenched himself on a nearby hill and took authentic pictures, but they also met with disappointment back in the United States. Shortly before the premiere, Darryl Zanuck admitted,
I'm afraid that our war scenes don't look as dangerous and realistic as the battle scenes we film at our studios. You simply can't have everything.
For these captured German and Italian troops, the war is over, but not for their comrades. They're not so lucky. In the end, even the Tiger tanks could not prevent an Allied victory in the desert. Hitler refused to allow his remaining troops in North Africa to withdraw. But in May 1943, they finally surrendered.
Casablanca, mid-January 1943. In the elegant suburb of Anfa, a hotel and several comfortably appointed villas have been cleared to accommodate delegations from Washington and London. On January 14th, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill travelled to Morocco with his top brass to attend a secret conference with the President of the United States. The British wanted to land on Sardinia or Sicily as soon as possible in order to attack the Third Reich from the south.
US President Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived in Casablanca exhausted from the 5-day Atlantic crossing. Since the age of 39, when he contracted poliomyelitis, the 60-year-old had been confined to a wheelchair. Since he avoided any pictures that showed his handicap, the president sat in a jeep as the American Guard of Honor marched past. A cameraman with the Signal Corps took these pictures of Roosevelt's trip to the Casablanca conference with 35mm color film for the president's own personal archive. They were not published until many years later. German propaganda had got wind of the meeting between the two statesmen, but Joseph Goebbels assumed that Churchill had travelled to Washington. In his diary, he wrote,
In our currently difficult situation, Churchill and Roosevelt will, of course, try to step forward with a demonstrative political statement designed to undermine our nation's morale. But I will do everything in my power to shield our people from such machinations.
Naturally, the US president and his generals knew that the Wehrmacht was facing a devastating defeat on the Eastern Front, because at Stalingrad, the Sixth Army had been encircled. The Americans were still clinging to the hope that an invasion could be launched across the English Channel in 1943, but they didn't have the requisite troops' strengths or the necessary equipment. For days, the Nazi leadership remained in the dark. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, which is now indisputable, is creating a stir. At the moment, we don't know where the two super gangsters met, but the press in both Britain and America has announced that sensational news of far-reaching importance will be forthcoming."
The Allies negotiated for 10 days. Roosevelt and Churchill then astonished the world public by stating that Nazi Germany and Japan had to surrender unconditionally. Italy was not mentioned in the press statement, so as not to undermine the possibility of a coup against Mussolini. The Casablanca Conference marked the zenith of Britain's influence on Allied strategy. From now on, the Americans would push their plans through more and more, in close alliance with Moscow. Joseph Stalin was not particularly impressed by the news from Anfa. The Soviet leader had been invited, but, with reference to the battle for Stalingrad, he had decided not to attend the conference.
In January 1943, cameraman Walter Frenz filmed a meeting of two of the Axis powers. The Führer had received Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu at the Wolf's Lair, his headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler was making the Romanians responsible for the precarious situation of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Antonescu countered by criticizing the Wehrmacht and its commanders. On Hitler's orders, the German people had not been told that the Sixth Army had been encircled for several weeks and stood no chance of receiving help from outside. The Führer categorically rejected any idea of capitulation. Nevertheless, on January 31st, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Red Army. The end of Nazi domination of virtually the whole of Europe was now only a question of time.
In the Balkans, partisan units in particular were making life difficult for the Germans. In August 1943, the Yugoslav resistance leader Josip Broz, who was known as Tito, received an Anglo-American military delegation at his mountain hideout. The scene was documented by a cameraman with the US Secret Service, OSS. Tito was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, in which he had proved his qualities as an organizer of the Communist International. He firmly believed that communists worldwide had to help their comrades in the Soviet Union. Tito's partisans accepted defeats and brutal reprisals by the Germans, and were also fighting against Croatian pro-Nazi collaborators. The British and the Americans had learned from decoded German radio messages that Tito's partisans would mount attacks no matter what the risk. So from then on, the Allies supported them with food and arms, and in doing so, turned a motley group of fighters into a powerful army.
Many Americans in particular held the naive view that communist resistance fighters just had to love freedom. Press reports time and again spoke of self-determination, the right of all nations to choose their own government, which Roosevelt and Churchill had guaranteed in the Atlantic Charter they proclaimed in 1941. The British Prime Minister was called an imperialist because he warned that after the Nazis had been defeated, communist parties would brutally crush all democratically minded forces in Stalin's name. And that's precisely what also happened in Yugoslavia under Tito's rule right through to 1980. At the conference in Casablanca, Churchill and Roosevelt also agreed to step up their air raids on German cities. Henceforth, the British flew at night and the Americans by day. Under the command of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, even residential areas were exposed to morale bombing, as the British called it. But the US US Air Force restricted its attacks to targets of military importance, such as submarine pans, armament factories, and German infrastructure. Hollywood director William Wyler was commissioned to document these dangerous operations. He was determined to fly on some of the missions himself and take pictures. On February the 26th, 1943, Wyler and his team filmed the crews of the 91st Bomb Group being informed at daybreak that their next target would be the naval base at Wilhelmshaven. The Americans were stationed at Bassingbourn Airfield near Cambridge. They had to cross the channel 25 times before they were allowed to go back home. Accordingly, Wyler's film was to be entitled 25 Missions.
The girlfriend of US pilot Robert Morgan had christened his bomber the Memphis Belle. Later, the B-17 Flying Fortress lent its name to one of the most successful films on the Second World War. In a radio interview, William Wyler was asked how he had experienced the operations over France and Germany.
Fear. Simple, honest fear. You're afraid of being killed. A feeling you've never had until you've been shot at. But there's an even more powerful feeling that really helps. When you look around and see the sky full of flying fortresses, and then look down at the enemy coastline, you'd rather be where you are than down below.
Wyler and the cameramen on board other aircraft had to work under the most difficult conditions. Above all, they had a real problem with the bitter cold at an altitude of more than 10,000 meters.
If you wanted to change the film, you had to take off your glove. But if you took it off for more than 1 or 2 minutes, you would lose some fingers from frostbite. Being on oxygen, your efficiency was at a minimum. Taking 3 steps was like walking a mile.
So far, there was no sign of enemy fighters, but then came the flak. William Wyler.
The flak was terrific. We'd fly through entire belts of it. The blue sky looked like a punctured sieve.
One of the cameramen was killed when his plane was brought down. In a letter, Wyler wrote,
I saw so many who never came back, but it makes a difference when it's one of my own people. Someone I recruited myself and sent off on a mission.
William Wyler filmed spectacular scenes of German fighters attacking the bombers. Finally, the big moment. The bomb aimer focuses on his target. Wilhelmshaven is now defenseless.
Later, Wyler constructed his picture as if these scenes had been filmed from the Memphis Belle. But on this particular day, in fact, the B-17 wasn't even in the air.
In the night of the 27th and 28th of July 1943, the British Royal Air Force attacked Hamburg. The bombs created a horrific firestorm, which raged for 5 hours in the workers' suburbs in the east of the city. The next day, fireman Hans Brunswick took these pictures of the firefighting operations. 24 hours after the raid, some of the fires were still burning. Around 150,000 people were left homeless. Hamburg author Hans Erich Nossack wrote,
Nothing around us bore any resemblance to what we had lost. It was something totally different, something alien, something that could not actually be possible. But why document all this? Would it not be better for it to be forgotten for all time?
in all, Operation Gomorrah, the military name for the bombing raids on Hamburg, claimed around 34,000 lives. Barely half the victims could be identified. People now fled from the devastated city in droves, homeless, desperate and terrified. An assembly centre was set up in Hamburg's Moorweide Park. The actual aim of the bombing campaign was to break German morale, but that was something the Allies never achieved. Fireman Hans Brunswick documented the exodus of the survivors. In the days after the first massive air raid, around 900,000 people left Hamburg. They were evacuated into the hinterland on trucks. Some tried to make their way to southern Germany, where they felt they would be safer.
In May 1943, work began in Hamburg and in a film studio in Berlin on the production of one of the Third Reich's last color films. But because of the increasing number of air raids, the shooting was moved to Prague. The aim of the entertainment film, Grand Freedom No. 7, was to take people's minds off the ever-present war. German film star Hans Albers played the main role in a love drama which took place on the Reeperbahn in Hamburg. But the censor refused to allow the film to be shown in Germany. It was thought that there were ulterior motives behind the title. What's more, the characters did not correspond to the Nazi ideal. Consequently, it was only after the war that the film became a classic.
The Nazi leadership was now placing its remaining hopes of final victory in what it called its wonder weapons. In late June 1943, the first V-2 rockets were tested in absolute secrecy at the experimental centre in Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The plan was to use the new type of missile to attack Allied cities in retaliation for the Allied bombing of German cities. For documentary purposes, all the tests were filmed, sometimes in colour. At the end of the war, the material was seized by the American Secret Service and taken back to the United States. In the early days, the test results were inconsistent. Time and again, things went wrong.
Engineer Werner von Braun had developed the new rockets and brought them up to production level. Although he was a member of the SS and used slave laborers from concentration camps in the construction of his rockets, von Braun was not put on trial by the Allies. Later, he was even allowed to head NASA's lunar program. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, traveled to Peenemünde to form his own impression of the V-2. Because of Allied bombing raids, production was moved to a mine in the Harz Mountains. On September the 7th, 1944, the first V-2 hit London.
Amid bombing raids now threatening to paralyze Germany's entire armaments industry, more and more facilities vital to the war effort are being moved underground or given special protection. In 1944, for example, a huge reinforced concrete colossus was built in the Bremen suburb of Fage for the construction of submarines. A naval architect filmed the work with his camera. He was one of the few cine enthusiasts who still had 16mm colour material. Unintentionally, he also recorded the brutality of the Nazi dictatorship. The project was built with slave labour from concentration camps. Despite the efforts of tens of thousands of workers from concentration camps, the Valentin bunker was never finished, and not a single submarine was ever built in it.
The Nazi propaganda machine still had some 35mm film at its disposal, and its camera teams were instructed to produce footage at the front and at home. These pictures show German dive bombers in action somewhere in Russia. In January 1944, Joseph Goebbels had at last given his approval to the old plan of producing a monthly color newsreel for showing in neutral countries. The first of 3 editions of Panorama were screened that same year. Scenes like these from ground attack aircraft in the east were probably filmed much earlier. In the summer of 1944, cameraman Heinz von Jaworski filmed on a Sunday in Berlin in the 5th year of the war. By now, Berlin journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich was hoping to see the end of Nazi rule. Yet, she had her doubts.
If we talk, plan or recruit followers, we will hang, because at least 1 person in 10 is treacherous or talks too much. Yet if we remain silent and are only up in arms in the silence of our own 4 walls, we keep the Nazis in power. That is the tragedy of our situation. Can a small group of 10 or 20 resolute souls topple the Third Reich? And we are only a small group. Small groups in Berlin, small groups in Dresden, in Breslau, or in Hamburg, a handful here, a handful there, who, like the king's children in the fairy tale, never come together.
Form of feudalism. The difference is that instead of the original feudalism, which is a system based on private ownership of land, which produces rent, now it's private ownership of the cloud, of cloud capital, because the cloud is capital, right? It's some cloud up in the sky, which yields again a form of rent. Every time you buy something from Amazon.com, 40% of what you pay doesn't go to the capitalist who is selling you that stuff, it goes to Jeff Bezos. That's a cloud rent, and here is a new form of feudal lord.
I think most people would accept this as a big new part of the global economy in the last 20 years. Where somebody might disagree with you is they would say, well, Yanis, this is ideological. You're presuming that this quite important, and highly discussed part of the economy, the richest person in the world, Elon Musk, the world's largest companies, or big tech companies. I didn't ever think it's a $3 trillion company. That's what Apple now is. They would say, fine, but look, wars still happen because of petrol, because of food, because of access to clean drinking water. The United States is worried about Taiwan because of its semiconductor manufacture. So the world still revolves around resources, minerals, rare earths, and manufactured commodities. Is that a criticism? Does that disagree with what you're saying? Or you presumably have a rebuttal to that?
Well, of course. I mean, it always did. Feudalism. I mean, think of the great clashes between the medieval forces, medieval powers. They were clashing over resources, over surplus distribution, over ideologies, over reach of empire. That was happening well before capitalism was established. So nothing has changed. And feudalism, capitalism, and now techno-feudalism in that regard. But if you're going to understand, for instance, you mentioned Taiwan. Why is Taiwan an issue now? If you ask them, the United States government, they'll tell you, oh, because Beijing wants to gobble it up. It always wanted to gobble it up. I mean, the United States has never recognized Taiwan because it recognized, as part of the deal between Nixon and Mao, that China has a claim to Taiwan. So what is new exactly? In my book, I try to explain what I think is new, and it's the rise of cloud capital, the shift from capitalism to techno-feudalism. Because if you think about it, after 1971, when the gold standard died and the dollar was no longer exchangeable with gold, the United States has built its power on a remarkable model of a world system whereby the United States has a huge trade surplus which acts as a vacuum cleaner, sucking into its territory the products of Chinese capitalists, Chinese labor to be precise, German, of Dutch, of Italian, Japanese of course. And how does it pay with that? For that, with IOUs, called dollars, because it prints them. And why do the Chinese, the Japanese, the German capitalists accept those IOUs, the dollars? Because they use it to take it back to Wall Street and to invest in real estate, in bonds, effectively financing the American government. So that's the model since the mid-1970s. And that whole model is predicated upon what? On the monopoly of the payment system of the dollar and the dollar payment system, right? What has happened in the last 10, 15 years, which I tried to map out in techno-feudalism, is that the Chinese are the only alternative locus in which cloud capital emerged. Europe has no cloud capital of its own. We don't have a Google, we don't have a Facebook, we don't have a Tesla, we don't have anything. Zero. Europe, and that includes Britain. The Chinese have.
We have OnlyFans. That's it.
So, if you take an app like WeChat, or if you take the digital currency that is being tested, massively tested, 135 million accounts by the Central Bank of China, they are developing the technology to have a payment system which is denominated not in dollars but in yuan. This rise of Chinese techno-feudalism, if you want a Chinese cloud fief, in contradiction with the American cloud fief, explains why Taiwan is an issue.
Yeah, I think it's a really original explanation for rising geopolitical tensions, which I've not seen elsewhere. I'm sure some people have sort of hinted at it, but the idea that what's really upsetting facing the United States is the emergence of big tech conglomerates that can compete with their own ones. And obviously, the most visible example of that is the geopolitical furore around TikTok, which you touch upon in the book. And I think it is true to an extent that clearly the world is diverging, particularly as we move into a world of AI, diverging into these two spheres of influence. There was a great paper a few years ago by PricewaterhouseCoopers saying that AI was going to add around $17 trillion to the global economy by 2030, 2035. And almost all of this is going to China and the United States. You know, none of it is going to South America or Africa.
Or Europe.
Or Europe, exactly. So I find that a really original argument. But to step back a bit, because I think you just mentioned what you referred to as the global minotaur in the book and what happens after 1971, which explains where we are now and even things like US-China relations. So let's go back to 1971. We have the disadoption of the gold standard by Nixon. Why did that happen? And what has it meant in the ensuing sort of period of 50 plus years now?
Thank you for the question, which is very dear to my heart, as you probably know. But before answering this, allow me to preface it with a comment about the thing you said at the beginning. It's not just that the Americans, that Trump initially and Biden later, worried that big tech in China is rising. It's not just that. That would not worry them so much on its own. It is that Chinese big tech, a company like Alibaba or Tencent or Huawei, is rising in a country where the banking sector does not have autonomous power, unlike Britain with the City of London and America with Wall Street. In China, because of the power of the Chinese Communist Party, the political power, the big tech companies and the banks have fused. They've become one. So you have an app like WeChat, which is Elon Musk's wet dream. What Elon Musk wants to do with Twitter is to replicate WeChat. WeChat, imagine an app that does everything. It shows you photographs, it plays music, it shows movies, it allows you to communicate, it's got something like Facebook on it, and allows you free payments. Free payments. You make payments and the bank does not retain anything either from you or from the vendor. The Americans do not have that. And they do not have that not because they don't have the technology to have that, but because JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America will never allow Google and Apple to get away with it, to take over their business. But if you fuse together big tech with big finance, you have something much more powerful, which is what the Chinese have done, than what the Americans have created. Another point about Das Gupta. Look, I'm not into projections about what will happen in 20, 30 years. Now, this is a book not of what is going to hit us in the next 5, 10 years. Yeah. This is a book about what has already happened. And now to your question. What happened in 1971, which I explained in the Global Minotaur, thank you for mentioning, and I can see a copy of it back there.
We're well read here at Navarro Media.
I can see that. Well, thank you for that. The story I tell in that book is that after the Second World War, the United States created a centrally planned capitalist global economy. Centrally planned. Because if you think about it, it's very difficult for young people today to wrap their minds around that. Between 1944 and 1971, 72, 73, we had fixed exchange rates. That is, you would never open the newspaper and try to find out what the exchange rate between the pound and the French franc, the pound and the US dollar was. It was fixed for years. I mean, I grew up in a world where there were 30 drachmas to a dollar, forever. Interest rates were fixed. Can you imagine a world where interest rates were not exactly fixed, but more or less around 4%? You knew that, if you borrowed money, you would be paying 4% forever. But that's like a centrally planned, Gosplan Soviet economy, more or less, without common ownership of the means of production. But it was planned. The only way that worked is if all these currencies were effectively based on the US dollar. So we had the dollar in different guises. But the only way we could have the dollar in different guises was that if the United States was a surplus country. Because if it was a surplus, while it was a surplus country after the Second World War, it was the only country that had a trade surplus. Every time they sold a jet or a car or a washing machine to a Brit, to a French person, to a German person, a quantity of dollars would go to the United States. So the United States would give us dollars, dollarize us, Marshall aid, for instance, other ways as well. Same to Japan. And then by selling us their wares, we would return the dollars, and that would complete the recycling loop. But for that to happen, they had to have a trade surplus. After 1968-69, they had a trade deficit, which means that they were leaking dollars. Dollars were a net stream or torrent of dollars was coming to Europe and to Japan. At some point, those who held the dollars, Germans, Brits, Saudi Arabians, Japanese, started worrying that they wouldn't be able to buy as much gold with the dollars because there was this increasing quantity of dollars. And that meant that the fixed exchange rate regime had to break down. And it broke down. And the Americans, instead of being yet another empire that lost its power, its political power, its military power, its hegemonic power, as a result of going into the red, managed, and it's the only empire that has ever managed that, to become more hegemonic by using their trade deficit in the way that I described before, to ensure that the Japanese, British, Dutch, German, French, Italian, and later Chinese capitalists needed the American trade deficit as a source of demand for their net exports to the United States. And this is the world that precipitated neoliberalism, precipitated the financialization, the crazy bets that were placed in Wall Street, and therefore led to the crash of 2008. And then after that, the central banks of the West, with the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, leading the way, started printing all the money that replaced capitalist profits. This is another part of techno-feudalism.
So this is more recently.
This is after 2009.
With the QE. There's an amazing, before we get to 2008, 2009 and quantitative easing, and I think that's really important to say that any Marxist knows that really, the history of the last, 75 years since World War II is a succession of trying to mollify and address crises, 71, the late 1980s, early 1990s, early 2000s, 2008. But what happens between 2002 and 2007 with regards to financialization is extraordinary, and the numbers are just mind-blowing for me. And you talk about this in the book. So in 2002, total global GDP, that's all the economic transactions, planetary economic transactions, which are monetized, 50 trillion US dollars. The worth of total global transactions by 2007 rises to 75 trillion. So it increases by 50%, which is obviously quite a lot. But when you look at the sum of bets of what you call in the global money market, that rises from 70 trillion in 2002 to 750 trillion. So it's more than 10 times increased.
Yep.
So what happens between 2002 and 2007 in terms of financialization and this huge explosion in financialized debts?
Deregulation. Thatcherism and Reaganism reached its crescendo with Blair here in this country and with Clinton in the United States. Effectively, the bankers were unshackled from all the constraints of the New Deal. The American New Deal and later the Clement Attlee and 1950s government's constraints on bankers. You see, governments had been burned once in 1929 because the Roaring Twenties were a period of unfettered financialization. The bankers, let's not forget, create money out of thin air. People talk about the money tree in order to lambast socialists, but it is the bankers who have access to the money tree, and they can pluck as much money from thin air as they want. And of course, when they overdo it, under the weight of all those mountains of money that they've created, they buckle under, and something like 1929 or 2008 happens. After 1929,
Because a certain amount of people can't pay back liabilities, and all of a sudden the whole thing's
look,
screwed.
when all these leveraged bets, that is, bets based on borrowing from the future, not from other people, but from the future, thin air. When let's make this once again clear that when Lloyd's Bank or Barclays Bank give you a loan, they are not giving you money that somebody has saved. They are conjuring it up like magicians. So effectively, they type into your bank account, £10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 pounds. That money doesn't exist. It's out of thin air. Bankers have this right that is given to them by society, by you and me, by our listeners and audience. And then, of course, while these bets work out, if the borrowers manage to make this money and also make the money to pay interest, bankers are laughing all the way to their own banks.
Surprisingly, they're very profitable when it works like that.
Exactly, and then they think that they deserve the money. But then at some point, all that is needed is a small pinprick to deflate this or to burst that bubble. And then what happens is you and I, and especially the working class of our countries, bail them out. And more money printing by central banks. So after 2008, 2009, we had 35 trillion printed on behalf of bankers. $35 trillion. To put it in context, back then, back in 2009 when that started, the total GDP income of the United States of America was 17, 18. So they printed 35. And they gave it to bankers. Now, bankers wanted to lend it to business people. Business people, however, looked around at the little people out there who were suffering under austerity, who were impecunious, who couldn't buy anything, as if they were going to invest it. So all this money that is being printed ends up inflating asset prices, artwork, house prices, and it never feeds into investment. That's why in Britain now you have this ridiculously low level of productivity because there's been no investment. And that's the same thing in the European Union. And the only entrepreneurs that care to take some of this liquidity and not just put it back to the stock exchange and instead use it to build up new capital are the tech lords. They took the money, and society, in other words, as a result of the inane handling by the establishment and the central banks of the 2008 crisis, effectively we have funded the build-up of masses of cloud capital. Cloud capital would always have been built, but not at that rate. Let me put it in terms of somebody who should know, McNamee, who wrote Zucked, a tech investor who was part of Facebook, one of the early investors in Facebook. He agrees with my assessment. He sent me an email recently saying so, that 9 out of the $10 that have been invested in what I call cloud capital came from central bank money.
That's
So
extraordinary.
it's feudalism. Remember, the sovereign printed the money, and the feudal lords used it together with their property rights over land to exploit the peasants and the vassals, which are today's capitalists who produce in the old-fashioned way using machinery, industrial robots, without cloud capital. And one last thing. If you want to understand the difference between Volkswagen and Tesla or Chinese cars, understand this. Tesla is connected to the cloud. That's why Elon Musk wanted Twitter. Every time a Tesla goes around, Tesla acquires enormous information about what music you are listening to while you're driving, where you're going. This is connected with the tweets that you send. And therefore, the value added to Tesla comes increasingly from the cloud and far less from the money you pay to buy the car. Volkswagen, because Germany, Europe, Britain, France, Italy, Greece, we have not invested in cloud capital. We cannot compete because we will never be able to well, you and I, of course, not. But even our capitalists are vassals to the American and Chinese cloudalists, the owners of cloud capital.
Novara Media has been around for more than a decade. It has grown to an extraordinary extent thanks to the generosity and kindness of our brilliant supporters. Downstream in that context is a bit more recent. It's only really appeared in the last couple of years. It's now become our standout interview show here on YouTube. It gives us an opportunity to talk about big ideas with brilliant minds, the kinds of people wrestling with the challenges we all have to confront in the 21st century. If you enjoy Downstream, if you enjoy the rest of our content here at Novara Media, obviously click the YouTube subscribe button. But if you want to go further than that, support our work financially. Make a one-off payment or a monthly one. We obviously prefer the latter if you can. And to do that, go to novaramedia.com/support to help build a people-powered media. Because we can all have political commitments to change the world, to get us out of the mess we find ourselves in, but as long as the billionaires, the media oligarchs own media in Britain and elsewhere, we're going to make very little progress. So like I say, help us build people-powered media. Go to novaramedia.com/support. I mean, it's an elegant hypothesis, but particularly this example you've just given of cars. You talk about how basically the German car manufacturing industry is over because their global comparative advantage is in high-quality engineering, the combustion engine, which has accumulated over, 100, 150 years of engineering expertise. But the cars of the 21st century require a very different skill set, very different resources, and they're going to be made by, if anyone, Alphabet, Apple, eventually, Tesla, various Chinese companies. So I think it's very elegant in that regard. And there's a really interesting point here as well. You talk about it at the end of the book. I don't want to talk about the end of the book just yet because we're only getting started. But about the kinds of coalitions you have to build. There was a really fascinating aside I heard recently, which was the triumph of Donald Trump can only be understood as a clash between national and family capital, which is to say that family capital, petty bourgeois capitalists, were on side with Trump against what they perceived as a national variant of often cloud capital, but also finance. We'll talk about some big finance firms like BlackRock and whatnot. And I thought that makes so much sense because that is precisely the fragment of the capitalist class. Petit bourgeois, we can park that. It's quite a difficult one to really explain. But that is the fragment which has been hammered by 15 years of QE, which has been hammered by globalization and deindustrialization. And so for me, it's hugely interesting that, people who historically the left has been very ambivalent about, the petty bourgeois, the small business owner, even the national capitalist making non-cloud commodities, there's the space there for interesting forms of alignment and alliance.
This is absolutely correct. But may I say that it is not entirely new? Which social class was behind Mussolini and Hitler? The petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
The petty bourgeois who was squashed by the crisis of the 1920s in Italy and then late 1920s and early 1930s in Germany. Fascism is a petty bourgeois phenomenon. It begins not from the working class, it starts from the petty bourgeoisie and then spreads to the working class once the crisis of capitalism begins to deplete industrial workers' jobs. Exactly the same happened after our generation's 1929, which I keep saying happened in 2008. Except that after 2008, the process of immiseration of the petty bourgeoisie and the working class was worse than it was in the 1920s and 30s. Because if you think about it, in the United States, all the factories shifted to China and to Vietnam. All of them. All of them. They just shifted. And it was a part of what I call in the book a dark deal. So the dark deal between Washington, D.C. and the Chinese Communist Party was, okay, we will send you over our machinery, you will produce the stuff. We will keep the IP, the intellectual property rights, in the case of Apple. So we will get a large share of the monopoly profits from selling iPhones, but you will keep the share, you'll keep the surplus value that you extract from your Chinese proletariat. You will be paid in dollars, which of course we mint as a deficit country, so they are worthless unless you send them back to Washington, and you will finance our government, and you'll get an interest rate on the bonds, the treasury bills that you will buy. At the same time you buy real estate. We will not let you buy companies unless they are useless and not particular. So you can't buy Google, you can't buy Bank of America. That's the same deal as they were giving to the Japanese in the 1960s. That is the deal that enriched Chinese capitalists and American rentiers at the expense of the American working class. People talk about the dominance of the dollar, and they assume that it's a good thing for the United States. It isn't. The dominance of the dollar is fantastic for American rentiers, and for Chinese capitalists, and Japanese capitalists, and German capitalists. And the people who actually suffer the most as a result of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar is the American working class, which was serially abandoned by the Democratic Party. And politics hates a vacuum. Donald Trump waltzed in and took it.
And I suppose people, just quickly on that, people might say, oh, well, we know that low-income earners vote Democrat, etc. Obviously, that's highly stratified on racial lines. But in those states where Trump gets over the line in 2016, former heavily industrialized states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that is precisely the story. And I think even now, 7 years later, it's very hard for the left to understand that it was former blue-collar workers, many in trade unions, who took Donald Trump to the White House. They may do again. I mean, who knows? It's a different world now. But, you know, I think they might do again. You say something as well, building on this, which is the worst thing you want as a Chinese capitalist is for Yuan to be the
dominant currency.
global currency replacing the dollar,
right.
which is quite funny because when people say it's the end of the dollar, you know, China is, you know, heading towards hegemony status, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, actually, if you're a Chinese exporter, that's a terrible thing to be
Indeed, or a
looking at.
German exporter. Why
Yeah.
do you think the euro never competed with the dollar for supremacy? Because the German capitalists would hate that. Why do you think we have no eurobond? Because the lack of a eurobond guarantees that the euro will never compete with the dollar. So German industrial capital does not want a eurobond, doesn't care so much about fiscal union and so on. It just doesn't want to lose access to the American trade deficit, which is the reason why they are, amassing all this surplus value. So yeah, we must stop thinking in football terms. You know, my nation against the other nation. You know, England versus Argentina. It's not that. The division is within our countries. It's between the capitalist class in China and the proletariat in China. The capitalist class, or the rentier class, not even the capitalist class, the rentiers and the techno-feudal lords in the United States that have diametrically opposed interests to those of 60% of the American population. Diametrically opposed. So, yeah, let's go back to thinking as left-wingers.
Can I ask a question? This isn't in my notes, but can I ask a question about the euro? Because the argument you're making about Eurobonds is really interesting. I've always been a critic of the euro, and I cannot understand why an Italian or a French leftist supports the euro, because the whole euro project, as I understand it, basically the sort of political economy of the eurozone, seems to be premised upon the idea of, well, basically it's for German exporters. It's destroyed two historically powerful, manufacturer exporter oriented countries, particularly Italy. You know, Italy is a share the size of the economy. Its share of proportionate rather to the size of its economy, its manufacturing base was about the same as Germany's, even as recently as sort of 10, 15 years ago, before 2008. And it seems obvious to me that membership of the Eurozone means permanent decline for Italians, permanent decline for Italy's productive
Permanent
base.
austerity.
Yeah, permanent austerity, permanent. And this is a G7 economy or G8 economy. The same for France, to a slightly lesser extent. And yet there aren't major movements in either country to leave the euro. I find it extraordinary. Now, I know there's huge downsides to leaving the euro. It'd be very painful. But the fact that's not even in the conversation in both nations is perplexing for me.
It was in the conversation, but it was killed off. Let me explain what the lure of the euro was for progressive people who were not sellouts, turncoats. Because the turncoats, we know why they wanted the euro. I have this memory of the 1970s when Greek trade unions would go on strike to gain some pay rise. Strikes are always extremely painful. There's a lot of sacrifice. Usually the strikers are never compensated. It's the strike breakers who get compensated because they get the pay rise even though they have not suffered any of the costs of the strike. And the next day, or 5 days after securing a 5% let's say, wage increase, the Bank of Greece would devalue the drachma and they would lose it all. So the notion of a currency that cannot be devalued was very attractive even to trades unions. What they did not factor in was that there was a price to pay for that. And the price was that there would be internal devaluation, that they would, not find one morning that their currency, the money they had in their wallet, was devalued as a result of an action of the Bank of Greece, but they would never get a pay rise. Indeed, they would get pay cuts. Don't forget that average wages today in Greece are 35% lower. 35% lower in nominal terms, not in absolute terms, than they were in 2007.
That's
right?
crazy.
Similarly with pensions. So that they didn't factor in. Once you get trapped into the Eurozone, it's like being in a house which is on fire but has no fire exits. You need to demolish the walls to get out. You put it very nicely when you said that the costs are very large, because this is exactly how it's been designed, to make the costs very large. You know that when we entered the Eurozone, our printing presses were destroyed. Did you know that?
No.
It was part of the deal.
No.
It was part of the deal. You have to, to dismantle and destroy.
Your national mint.
Like the IRA had to destroy its weapons as part of the Good Friday Agreement, we had to destroy our printing presses as we entered the Eurozone. Now, somehow, I don't believe that the Bundesbank, the Germans, destroyed their printing presses. But we certainly did, and so did the Italians.
That's extraordinary. And what you just said there about nominal, I mean, just for people to understand, nominal means, look, we're not talking about inflation or what you can buy. We're literally talking about the currency.
Yeah.
And I saw a statistic recently about the purchasing power of 18 to 35-year-old Italians. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 50.
It's declined precipitously since the 1990s.
Yeah, I think it's basically 50% what it was 20 years ago.
Yes.
And you think, you only get to live once.
But that's why we have a neo-fascist in government.
Well, quite, exactly.
Yeah.
Of course people are going to be angry.
That's why the Socialist Party died. That's why the Communist Party doesn't exist, because it accepted this process. And the only voices that are supported by the public in Italy are the ones who remain anti-establishment, unfortunately, as descendants of Mussolini.
I mean, I understand why people are angry. I do understand why they turn to the far right, because you only get one shot at life. You're around for 70, 80 years, and there is a political settlement which is screwing you over so badly. It's depriving you of the life you expected, which you deserve, and nobody in the political class is doing anything about it.
Don't forget the other great danger for countries like Italy and Greece. Emigration. Not immigration. Emigration. The problem is not that the Africans are coming. The problem is that the Greeks and Italians are leaving.
Or particularly for Greece. I mean, in recent years,
Italy
it's been
too.
extraordinary.
Italy. Young Italians are all over the place. They're leaving. Today, as we speak, they're leaving.
So do you think then, I mean, so let's build on this for a moment. We agree that the Eurozone really locks in permanent austerity and industrial decline for some really big countries historically. France, Italy, Greece as well, of course.
Germany as well. But remember the class analysis? The lower bottom of the German population or income distribution are now 15% worse off than they were 20 years ago.
Although, their capitalist class is doing very well. Yeah.
Well, the big capitalist class are doing extremely well.
Yeah.
The
The shipping magnates. Yeah.
Not just the shipping magnates. No. I can give you names.
Please.
Yannis Peristeris, Mitilineos, Melisanides. They don't make money so much out of shipping, but they own the power generation and power distribution network as a result of the privatization of our formerly nationalized power grid. They charge an arm and a leg for that. The cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, has allowed them to multiply by a factor of 4 their surpluses. They own every single television station, and anyone dares speak their name in parliament gets absolutely vilified and demonized. So, you have a dictatorship of those oligarchs who are... come to Athens, I'll take you to the northern suburbs. You see the Lamborghinis and the Porsches and the Ferraris.
Well, I'll hold you to that, Yannis.
Yeah.
You can show me.
It's
you
a
can show us
very
around.
very ugly scene.
Okay, so what I would say, I'm not suggesting for one moment that the German working class get a better deal out of it. But what I would say is, there is a fragment of Italian or French capital who gets a really bum deal out of this industrial capital, which, comparatively speaking, was getting a better deal 25 years ago.
That's why they were giving a lot of money from the coronavirus recovery fund to keep them sweet, and they've kept them sweet. They gave them something like 130 billion
So
to keep them happy.
let's talk about COVID, because this is interesting, right?
Well,
Because
the pandemic was a major, major boon. It was a manna from heaven for the establishment. Manna from heaven. I'm not talking about vaccines and all that. I'm talking about an opportunity to take on a lot more debt, pile it up on the shoulders of the weaker, of the working classes, and distribute it amongst themselves. Only in Greece, in 18 months, during the pandemic, the right-wing government was allowed to borrow another 60 billion in a country where GDP is around 90. It's a huge amount. Given that we were already hugely indebted, they gave them another 60 billion to spread the money around. That's why they won the election.
so there are these moments that we're chronicling in the rise of first the global minotaur and then what you call techno-feudalism. 71, 2008, and then more recently 2020.
Yeah.
And you claim really that after 2008, Western capitalism has a 1929 moment. But then through the years of QE and through the pandemic, we basically see the end of capitalism as we know it. Can you explain why all this money printing that's primarily going to the top 0.01%, why is it the end of capitalism and the transition to something else?
You see, it depends on how you define capitalism. Because different people, I have a Marxist definition of capitalism, but not everybody does. Some people think, the marketplace, buying and selling, not having the state telling you what to buy and how much to pay for it. That's capitalism. No, it's not. Capitalism is a system based on the private ownership of the essential means of production, and a system which is predicated on profit that comes out of surplus value, exploitation of labor, of wage labor, and markets. The whole point about the transition from feudalism to capitalism was that you had the process of commodification of land as a result of the enclosures, getting rid of the peasants, and commodification of labor. During feudalism, land and labor didn't have markets. Workers worked, but they couldn't quit, they didn't receive a wage, just that the feudal lord sent the sheriff over to collect rents from them. Okay? So markets and profits, the two pylons on which capitalism sits, both of them are now optional and actually a sideshow. Instead of profits, you have central bank money combined with cloud rents, the 40% of the price you pay on Amazon retained by Jeff Bezos. All the surpluses that private equity firms get. Remember, 3 companies, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, own 90% of all companies in the New York Stock Exchange. They don't make profits. They make rents. So you have rent replacing profit and Amazon.com-like companies, platforms, replacing markets. Amazon.com, Alibaba, Uber, they are not markets. They are platforms where trading takes place, buying and selling, outside the marketplace. They're like digital fiefdoms, owned by a techno-feudal lord who collects rents. Remember, Uber doesn't have cars. In the same way that the landlord did not participate in production, he simply collected. That's what Uber does. That's what Airbnb does. That's what Amazon.com does. So if you replace the two pylons of capitalism with cloud rent primarily, and digital platforms, and all that is founded on a foundation of cloud capital, what you end up is something which is not like capitalism. Now, we could have called it capitalism. I could have called the book digital capitalism. I could have called it cloud capitalism. I could have called it rentier capitalism. Some of my colleagues, like Guy Standing, call it rentier capitalism. But you see, I think it's important to ditch the word capitalism. Why? Because if this was the 1770s, and we were talking about the state of the world, what was going on then? Capitalism was already upending and undermining feudalism, taking over from feudalism. We could have called the new system, instead of calling it capitalism, we could have called it industrial feudalism. But that would have robbed us of the opportunity to concentrate our mind that this is a great transformation. It's not feudalism anymore. Even though it would have been technically correct to call it industrial feudalism or capital feudalism. For the same reason, I'm making the controversial claim that this is not capitalism anymore, even though it is a result of the triumph of capital.
Before we go to the next question, the thing about Amazon, I think can often be understated. People think, like you say, these aren't necessarily market transactions. It even goes beyond that to an extent. So, for instance, I'm sure people watching and listening to this are familiar with the Amazon Basics range. You know, where you get a product which looks almost exactly the same as another one, but it's, 30% cheaper or whatever. Those products are created precisely because they have the analytics to look at the most profitable products with the best margins, with the highest volumes sold, the lowest customer returns, and they say, let's make exactly the same thing. So they don't just own the keys in terms of can I enter, the town square to sell my goods and services. They also have data that the sellers don't have themselves.
Of course, that is the whole point.
It's incredible.
Same with Uber.
Yeah, incredible.
Now, why can't Uber drivers get together and create their own app? Well, they could. But that app would not have all the data that Uber has on you and me, and including the drivers. So it is this cloud capital, the algorithm, to put it this way, the algorithm, which creates the land, the digital land, where you must be in order to survive as a capitalist, and therefore a vassal, or as a cloud serf.
Do you think we're going to have a war with China?
I very much fear so. Very much fear so. Every move that Biden is taking is one more step closer to some kind of confrontation. Of course, I hope I'm wrong. And maybe it won't happen, maybe it will happen. But it is a clear and present danger.
Because it seems to be something that people just underprice, that, the idea of a conflict between two powers as geopolitical influence shifts from the west to the east, that can't happen. To me, it sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. If you look at the nuclear war clock, it's much closer to midnight now than it ever was. So at least the nuclear scientists and the peace movement that are running that particular measure of the risk that we're facing as a species are not underselling it.
And given techno-feudalism's concentration in the Western Hemisphere and East Asia, does that mean Europe's over? Does that mean just
Yes.
Europe is finished?
Yes. Europe is over. I was chatting with Andres Manuel, the president of Mexico, a few months ago, and we had this conversation. And he said, Yanis, look, as a Mexican, I'm closer to Europe than I am to the United States, culturally, spiritually, politically, ideologically. But Europe is irrelevant to us. It's a BRICS, China, in other words, BRICS. The only thing that matters from the BRICS is the sea. China and our huge neighbor north of our border. And I see this wherever I go, and it makes perfect sense. Look, Aaron, let's just for a moment imagine, with great hope, that there is a peace process that starts for Ukraine tomorrow. This big table, somewhere in the UN, Geneva, wherever. We know who will represent Ukraine: Zelensky, Russia, Putin, America, Biden, China, Xi, India, Modi. Who's going to represent Europe? You just ask yourself that question, and then suddenly you realize how irrelevant Europe is. Because it used to be Merkel. Merkel had the political power and clout to do it. Scholz doesn't. Macron doesn't. Why? Not only because they are pipsqueaks compared to Merkel, they are, but because anything they say will be vetoed by the government of Poland, the government of Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, who consider them to be Putin's handmaidens, both Scholz and Macron. I'm not passing by judgment, I'm simply describing. So the two countries that will have to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine will not be allowed to represent the European Union in these negotiations. And so who will? Von der Leyen? I mean, she's only there because she failed as a minister in Merkel's cabinet, and Merkel wanted to get rid of her and sent her to Brussels, because in Brussels you can't hear them scream. Remember the line from Borgen? So Europe is politically, this political paralysis reflects the fact that we don't have any cloud capital.
Yeah, and I would add as well, Europe's demographic pyramid is a nightmare. I mean, China's isn't great, but Europe's is a nightmare if you include obviously the East and Central Europe. Energy resources,
You know that's I insist.
cloud capital, geography.
It is cloud capital. Nothing else. Everything else we could have gotten out of. If you don't have a competitor to Google, a competitor to Uber, a competitor to Facebook, a competitor to Apple, a competitor to Amazon.com, if every German or Italian or French or British producer has to go through those cloud lists in order to sell their stuff, even in Europe, and you know Amazon makes 42 billion every year only in Europe and pays zero. Well, you're gone. You're finished.
It's interesting as well with Europe because recently the sort of spokespeople, and this might sound a little like Little England or something, it's not meant to be, it's an observation. The sort of spokespersons of the last 2 years of Europe in the whole Ukraine-Russia conflict have really been statespeople from smaller countries. So this lady, Kaja Kallas, I think, from Estonia,
Yeah.
she's speaking on behalf of Europe, and you think, well, then Europe must be buggered. Because if you can't have Sanna Marin or Callas speaking on the behalf of the German, the French, the Italian, the British, the Spanish people with regards to big foreign policy choices. Because when push comes to shove, they're going to say, sod off. I don't know who you are. I've never seen you before. But within the media discourse, they go, she's so brave. She might go work for NATO. She'll be the general secretary or whatever.
See, we
Great,
are
good for
deferring
her.
to NATO. The EU has gone. It's been replaced by NATO.
Exactly.
Stoltenberg, whom we didn't know his name until the war in Ukraine, suddenly is running Europe. And Callas, I wouldn't mind if a woman, young woman, from a small country represented me as a European. I'd love that. You know what I mind? If you ask her, so what's the end game? Define victory in the war in Ukraine. The only logical answer, consistent with what she wants and says, is to take Moscow. Because she's talking about dragging Putin to the international court. Now, I would like all these bastards to be dragged to the international court, including Tony Blair, right? Of course, I'd love that. But how are you going to drag Putin to the international court? You have to take Moscow. There's no other way. Or you are going to have to incite a coup in Moscow that will bring about regime change. If that happens, because Putin has killed off all the progressives, whoever takes over from Putin will be worse than Putin. So Callas, Miss Callas, can you please tell me what the end game is? Her answer terrifies me. That is the problem I have with Miss Callas.
There's this huge disconnect between foreign policy and defence preferences. And it's like the electorate don't matter. 400 million Europeans do not matter. Here's the final question. You say that we've seen the eclipse of capitalism really since 2008. You also think we've seen the death of liberalism and the idea of the liberal individual. What does that have to do with cloud capital?
The whole point about liberalism is the celebration of the individual as a source of legitimacy. A country, a political system is legitimate in the liberal mind to the extent that it represents the autonomous will of individuals. Remember Thatcher? There is no such thing as society, it's only individuals, families and individuals. But if the individual has a relationship with cloud capital, with Amazon's Alexa, whereby the individual trains Alexa to train the individual to train Alexa to train the individual to train Alexa, to put into the individual's mind what he wants or she wants or it wants, where is this autonomy? Hayek, the greatest guru of Thatcher, used to celebrate the market as a mechanism that not only finds the right prices to equilibrate demand and supply, but the mechanism that actually is allowing us to develop our own character. He used to say, I go into a shop and I come out with something I didn't even know I wanted. So the marketplace shapes me as a person, as an autonomous, liberal individual on whom the whole liberal project is based. But if it's not the market, but the centrally planned system that the Soviet Union would love to have had, because that's what Amazon.com is. It's a centrally planned machine that belongs to one man, who could be Jeff Bezos, who could be Joseph Stalin. Then where is the liberal individual in this? Gone. In a puff of smoke.
So basically this idea that there's a tyranny really of big tech, and it doesn't just inflect economies, but our sort of very psyche and psychology. I mean, that's a big claim.
But it is, Aaron. Look, I was talking to some students of mine a couple of years ago, and young people who wanted a reference for me to find a job, go and study at postgraduate level. And I saw this in full technicolor. You know, they were angst-ridden because they know that when they go to get interviewed for whatever, to go to university, but primarily to get a job in a good job, the interviewer will have checked their social media presence, footprint. Every photo that they upload, every video on TikTok at midnight, they know or they assume will be seen. So there's no demarcation between work and play. And they are constantly trying to imagine what kind of self they should create in their own bosom, in their own soul, that will appeal to Google or to Facebook or to a good employer. That's the end of the liberal individual.
To conclude, it sounds like we're returning to feudal Europe, but with a touch of the Stasi. Doesn't sound good. I mean, that's a good.
Well, the Stasi
encapsulation.
would have loved cloud capital. They would be kicking themselves because, you know, they created all these amazing mechanisms for surveillance. And, you know, we volunteered our information to this.
Wiki Stasi. On that note, Yanis, it's a great book. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Hello, I'm Yanis Varoufakis. I'm at Novara Media, and I have a message for you. The best way of underpinning any kind of potential resistance to a very toxic establishment without being populist anti-establishment and by supporting good, rational, humanist causes is to support left-wing media like Novara Media. Novara Media and all such media need your support because they certainly do not have the support of the establishment. Carpe diem. Wall Street and big tech and the City of London together own your identity. You have to pay to use your own identity. If we're going to be people, and if we're going to turn this into a viable society, the global society, we must forget about taxing. We must think in old Marxist terms, how do we take their capital away from them? This is not a viable system. It's a system we live in. We are stampeding towards oblivion.
Yanis Varoufakis, hello, how are you?
Very well.
Good.
Very happy to be here.
Very happy to have you here. Before we get into the subject matter today, your book, Techno-Feudalism, I'd invite you to tell the audience who you are, what you do, in your own words.
Well, I used to be an academic that no one knew anything about because I was cocooned in my university office writing esoteric texts that maximum 20 people around the world cared for, and I didn't mind. Until I started feeling in the early 2000s that the world is heading towards another 1929 discontinuity, let's put it mildly. And at that moment I thought that I don't have the right, the moral right, to carry on playing around with my mathematical models of game theory. And I started writing fiery articles and books, including The Global Minotaur, which became quite a significant text, even if I'm saying so myself, regarding 2008. It was a time when I was also shifting from Australia to my home country, Greece, which was always going to be ground zero of the European great financial crisis. And at some point, having opened my mouth once too often and written too many articles about it, a young man who was leading the Greek opposition at the time, this is now 2010, 11, 12, 13, at some point invited me to become the finance minister if he were to win, which I did. And so, you know, from obscure mathematical texts, I was elevated to becoming the finance minister of the most bankrupt state in Europe, the world. That lasted 6 months because we had a pact, the Prime Minister and myself, that we would never accept another bailout loan under conditions of crashing 80% of the population. He decided that he wanted to surrender. I decided I'm not going to surrender. And that's it. I resigned and then created my own party, going from small victory to grand failure, writing books all the time as therapy. So that's why.
Okay, perfect. Let's indulge then in another hour of therapy, talking about this book. We're going to get into the concepts in it, we're going to go into it in detail, but top line for people who are just here to begin with, what's it about? Why is it important? Why should people read it?
We all feel in our bones that this crisis is never ending. It is metamorphosizing, taking different crisis of deflation, falling prices, of falling wages, crisis of the cost of living crisis, of inflation. We know that there is something dismally wrong with the world. That, you know, capitalism was always a system that produced crisis and newfangled forms of poverty and depravity. But what has been happening over the last 15 years is unique. We haven't experienced that since the 1770s, 1780s, this sort of universal sense of angst that everybody shares, including, of course, about the climate. My view is that the reason why we're experiencing this is not that capitalism is going through another one of its normal crises, but rather we are at a turning point, very much like the 1770s, 1780s, when there was a great transformation, as Karl Polanyi put it, from feudalism to capitalism. Under feudalism, power sprang out of the land. Anybody who owned land, the landed gentry, had power, and it was all sorts of power packed in one: political power, economic power, cultural power. If you were the aristocracy or part of it, you had it, and you couldn't distinguish between political and economic power. And the wealth came out of rent, the rents that the aristocrats, the landed gentry, charged vassals and peasants and so on. And then there is this great shift from land to machinery to capital, and from rent to profit. through the commodification of land, the commodification of labor. Even though peasants worked very hard, their labor was not a commodity. They couldn't quit. They didn't receive a wage. There was no labor market. Similarly for land, there was no market for land. Either you had it or you didn't have it. And then everything was commodified. So that was capitalism. It starts here in this country and in Amsterdam around the end of the 18th century, and it continues to this day. Now, I mentioned before that it was in the 2000s that I was feeling that some major crisis was coming. In 2008, the City of London, Wall Street, so on, in my estimation, created a rupture in capitalism. It wasn't anything like, not even like 1929. It was even more substantial than that. And for a number of years, I was trying to think about what on earth is happening. And I came to the very controversial conclusion, which is this book, that in the same way that we shifted from feudalism to capitalism, we're now shifting, without realizing it, to a new form of feudalism, a very advanced, almost science fiction form of feudalism. This is why I call it techno-feudalism. But essentially, we have a new land, which is the cloud, and we have a new landed gentry. You can call them cloudalists, or the techno-feudal lords, the lords of the cloud, like Jeff Bezos, just one example, or Zuckerberg. And power is shifting from the owners of machinery, of standard machines, even industrial robots, even advanced machinery, to the owners of this network of machines that creates this digital version of land. And just one last point to explain to our audience what I mean by that. When you enter Amazon.com or Alibaba or one of those digital platforms, people think that they enter a marketplace. They do not enter a marketplace. They enter a digital fiefdom. Because come to think of it, even though you buy and sell, it's all mediated by an algorithm that belongs to one person who doesn't produce anything except for this landscape. And how does Bezos make his billions? If you produce a book or a bicycle or anything that you sell through Amazon.com, he keeps 40%. That's a rent. Suddenly, we've gone from profits to rents, but this time it's not rents that you charge for the use or the leasing of land, but the leasing of the cloud. So I call them cloud rents. And the more I thought about that, the more I convinced myself that this is a great transformation, which is hugely important, not theoretically, but for me, the idea of the liberal individual gone. You can no longer be a genuine liberal or even a libertarian, if I'm right. Social democracy, gone. What was social democracy? It was a kind of mediation between industrial capital and organized labor, gone. Because industrial capital now is being exploited by those people. They get 40% of whatever they produce. And no one is going to negotiate with Jeff Bezos. No one. No government can make any group of workers sit down with Jeff Bezos, or they can't make Jeff Bezos sit down with any group of workers and carry out a social democratic bargain or New Deal or whatever. And also, if you look at the clash between the United States and China, why is this happening? Taiwan is not the reason. Taiwan was always a problem. National security is not the reason. My view is that what you have is two cloud fiefdoms clashing. The American one, based on Silicon Valley and Wall Street, and the Chinese one. And Europe is non-existent because we don't have a cloud. So anyway, that's the whole story, really.
And we'll drill down.